The world once teetered on the brink of an unprecedented catastrophe, a threat that could have forever altered the course of history. This pivotal moment, etched into the annals as the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought humanity to the precipice of full-scale nuclear war. The genesis of this unparalleled confrontation was October 16, 1962, when the head of the American state, President John F. Kennedy, received a stunning revelation. Soviet nuclear missiles had been discovered on Cuban territory. This discovery, made possible by U-2 reconnaissance flights, posed an immediate and profoundly serious threat to the national security of the United States. In response to such a critical situation, Kennedy and his closest advisors immediately convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM, to discuss all possible courses of action in utmost secrecy. For 13 agonizing days, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next move. The spectrum of options discussed was broad, ranging from a full-scale military invasion of Cuba to the establishment of a naval blockade. Ultimately, the latter option was chosen, which Kennedy prudently termed a quarantine, to avoid the complex legal ramifications associated with an official declaration of a blockade. This strategic maneuver aimed to impede further shipments of Soviet military equipment to Cuban territory while creating space for diplomatic negotiation. Alongside the overt confrontation, intense secret negotiations were also underway, hidden from public view. The United States, using Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy as a communication channel, maintained contact with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. A key breakthrough in these delicate discussions occurred when the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba. In return, the American side pledged not to invade Cuba and also made a secret agreement to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The resolution of the crisis, which came on October 28, 1962, was a moment of universal relief, averting what would have inevitably become a catastrophic nuclear exchange. This event starkly underscored the inherent dangers of the nuclear age and served as a catalyst for a period of détente in international relations. Both superpowers, having faced the threat of mutual annihilation, recognized the vital necessity of improving communication channels and crisis management mechanisms. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a vivid and unsettling reminder of how close humanity came to complete devastation. But history holds other secrets, waiting to be unveiled. Let us now transport ourselves to a different time and place, embarking on a thrilling journey by land and sea, with the goal of uncovering the true discoverer of North America. We will trace the incredible path of two courageous explorers, Eric the Red and his son, Leif Erikson. These intrepid seafaring pioneers traversed the turbulent waters of the Atlantic a full 500 years before Christopher Columbus set foot on the shores of the New World. In pursuit of this elusive truth, we will explore ancient Danish longships, delve into the history of Iceland's mines, traverse the icy expanses of Greenland, and finally, land on mysterious coasts. No effort will be in vain in this quest for knowledge. While the Welsh and even the Chinese lay claim to being the first to arrive in America, no arguments sound as convincing as the Icelandic sagas. These ancient tales recount Nordic explorers who journeyed west from their homeland in Scandinavia, discovering new lands. Iceland was colonized in 860, and when all habitable territories were occupied, the Vikings, driven by a thirst for new discoveries, continued their westward journey, finding and colonizing the icy island known as Greenland. The Icelandic sagas preserve accounts of a truly extraordinary feat. A Viking named Leif Erikson, according to legends, crossed the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic and reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. But could this bold legend be true? To unravel this historical enigma, we must journey to an ancient settlement in Denmark, where various types of Viking ships have been meticulously reconstructed and carefully preserved. The main question requiring an answer is, were these ancient Viking ships truly capable of crossing the vast open ocean? A maritime archaeologist will present an impressive and complete collection of these vessels. Many of them sank, and the silt deposits at the bottom of the fjord miraculously protected them from the destructive effects of time. The ships were so well preserved that the research team was able to build exact replicas, on which real sea voyages are subsequently undertaken. Meeting the captain of such a reconstructed Viking ship will reveal exactly how a vessel capable of transatlantic passage was built. According to him, one type of ship that struck terror on the coasts of Europe would have been shattered trying to cross the North Atlantic. This is why the Vikings developed and built a completely different type of vessel, perfectly suited for long sea voyages. In 2000, such a replica was built, and a historic voyage was made on it from Iceland to North America. This journey became irrefutable proof that Viking ships could indeed cross the Atlantic. This boat was created with the utmost authenticity, precisely replicating those built by the Vikings. Its sail was made using a unique Viking technology. Square wool panels were meticulously sewn and treated with a special resin similar to tar. The sail had an impressive area of 9 square meters and weighed over 500 kilograms, highlighting the scale of ancient shipbuilding. Life aboard a Viking ship required incredible endurance and physical strength. The windlass, used as a mechanical aid, helped in steering, but every movement required significant effort. This ocean-going vessel could reach speeds of up to 13 knots, which is about 24 kilometers per hour, and carried up to 24 tons of cargo with a crew of 8, an outstanding achievement for its time. But Holland, one of the experts, is not just an experienced sailor on Viking ships. Several years ago, he made an astonishing discovery. He turned out to be a direct descendant of Erik the Red and Leif Erikson himself, which adds a completely different dimension to his research. In the Viking Age, the ability to turn against the wind was truly revolutionary technology. Although it was hard work, the Vikings could continue moving forward even when the wind blew directly into their faces, giving them a huge advantage. Viking ships were capable of sailing in the open ocean, but to venture into unknown territories, more than just courage was required. They must have had some powerful motivation, as the ships offered little protection from the inhospitable Atlantic climate. It is known that Erik's father was exiled, which could have been one of the reasons for the migration. Although the exact number of ships that sailed from Scandinavia to Iceland remains unknown, transporting 30,000 people undoubtedly required dozens of such vessels, attesting to the grandeur of these early voyages. When sailing, Vikings typically aimed to keep land in sight, but to cross the Atlantic Ocean, they inevitably had to leave the relatively safe coastal waters and chart a course across thousands of kilometers of boundless seas. Notably, the magnetic compass, so common in modern navigation, would not appear for another 2 centuries. The question arises, how did they navigate? These brave Scandinavians crossed the Atlantic without any modern navigational aids, relying solely on subtle environmental clues. They carefully observed wind direction, noted the presence of whales and seabirds, and looked for seaweed on the water's surface that might indicate proximity to land. Some researchers believe that the Vikings possessed a deep understanding of the relationship between the sun's position and geographical latitude. Supporting this theory is the discovery of a wooden disc in one of the Viking settlements in Greenland, which may have served as a sun compass, an instrument designed to determine a ship's course. Even without such a complex device, with a favorable wind, it would have taken a captain only 4 or 5 days to reach the intended point. It seems the legendary Erik the Red had little choice. In 960, it was Erik the Red who undertook his famous journey across the North Atlantic to the shores of Iceland. The travelers headed to the northwestern part of Iceland to locate Erik's former dwelling. They followed in the footsteps of this remarkable Viking navigator who, departing from Scandinavia, became the first European to cross the Atlantic 1,000 years ago, a full 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Earlier, in Denmark, researchers had the opportunity to sail on a reconstructed Viking ship, where they learned about the unique features of Viking shipbuilding that allowed them to create vessels capable of crossing thousands of kilometers of ocean. There, they were also told details about the life of Erik the Red, whose nickname reflected not only his fiery red hair, but also his unrestrained, sometimes wild temperament. Exiled from his homeland in 982, he was forced to go to Iceland, and it was this historical path that modern adventurers followed. Iceland is a vast island, comparable in area to Ireland, yet its interior remains virtually uninhabited. Even today, the vast majority of the population lives on the coast. The history of Eric the Red's time is carefully preserved in the Icelandic sagas, a unique collection of oral traditions passed down through generations. These tales recount the people who arrived on the island approximately 1,200 years ago. In search of the truth, the travelers planned to meet with a saga specialist at the very place where Eric once lived, located 160 kilometers north of the capital, Reykjavik. A natural question arose. Could a 1,000-year-old story be so geographically precise? A professor at an Icelandic university has dedicated his entire professional life to studying the Icelandic sagas. According to him, the discovered structure, 28 meters long and 6 meters wide, is a typical example of architecture from that period. Timber was very rare in those days and was only used for constructing the framework. Outside, the Vikings clad the walls with sod, allowing them to create structures up to 1.5 meters thick. This solution provided excellent insulation in harsh winters. The professor also explained that the sagas were not eyewitness accounts. They were transcriptions of oral narratives about extraordinary events that occurred 2 centuries before they were recorded. The sagas tell how Eric married a farmer's daughter, who gave the couple land in this valley, where Eric built his homestead. At first glance, the sagas seem quite accurate. Archaeological research has not only confirmed that this was indeed Eric's farm, but has also established that the traces of walls behind the reconstructed building are the authentic ruins of Eric's home. However, the professor clarified that by marrying the farmer's daughter, Eric did not receive the best land. The plot was on the very outskirts of the family's holdings and in close proximity to a neighboring farm. Soon, Eric found himself embroiled in a fierce land dispute, which he lost, and was once again outlawed. Eric had already been exiled from Scandinavia, and after another expulsion, he had no choice but to go west. At that time, rumors circulated about a land supposedly seen by a sailor who had gone off course. Eric made the bold decision to colonize this new territory and managed to persuade his relatives and friends to join him, promising them untold riches from future trade. Even today, reaching southwestern Greenland is a challenging endeavor, requiring 3 days of travel for plane flights, 2 helicopter rides, and finally, a boat trip. Modern researchers plan to look for signs that Eric and his companions were able to transform this harsh and seemingly barren land into a thriving colony. They continued to follow in the footsteps of the great Viking navigator Eric the Red, a man constantly pursued by exiles. In 985, fleeing for his life, he left Iceland and founded a colony on the vast, icy island west of Iceland. Even today, despite the availability of aviation, reaching southern Greenland remains difficult. The first leg of the modern journey was a 3-hour flight to Kalusuk, located on the eastern side of the island. Safely inside the plane, passengers observed the icy sea, dotted with numerous icebergs. Eric's journey, unlike the modern one, was extremely treacherous and required tremendous determination, outstanding skill, and a good deal of luck. Of the 25 ships that set sail, only 14 managed to reach their destination. The rest were forced to return or perished in the depths of the sea. Finally, the travelers arrived in Greenland, filled with deep excitement, for they could not have imagined ever being in this remote corner of the world. However, their final destination was still far off. They had to overcome more than 1,600 kilometers of snow and ice. Kalusuk Airport served only as a transfer point to the west coast of Greenland. From there, they would fly south, to the places where Eric the Red once lived. Immediately after takeoff, the plane flew over the majestic glaciers of the ice fields covering most of the island. It should be noted that if all this ice melted, global sea levels would rise by 4 to 6 meters. After 3 hours, the landscape abruptly changed to rocky formations, and the plane landed in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. After a brief stop, the travelers transferred to a smaller plane heading to Narsarsuaq. They were joined by Caroline, a researcher from Denmark who came to study the Viking colony in Greenland. The plane flew 640 kilometers south, heading towards Brattahlid, the area Eric chose for his settlement. They were very close to their goal. Caroline pointed out that they were flying over Eriksfjord. It was here that Eric and his companions settled after arriving in Greenland. Only a helicopter flight remained to the final destination, but this small inconvenience was more than compensated by the magnificent scenery. Even today, this place remains difficult to inhabit. There are no roads or railways, and the only way to reach the snow-covered villages is by air. The travelers are finally approaching their final destination. After a 12-hour journey, they finally find themselves in the area that Viking colonists once named Brattahlid. However, they still have a boat trip and a subsequent walk ahead of them. Seeing blue ice for the first time is truly an unforgettable experience, a sight whose beauty must be believed only by seeing it firsthand. After this slight detour, the expedition team changes their route, heading to a place where they will spend 2 days, within walking distance of the nearest settlement. They will camp tonight, as a long trek awaits them after disembarking. Caroline, accompanying them, states that this region looked very similar when the first settlers arrived more than 1,000 years ago. Although the land here is green and fertile, there are no suitable flat areas for raising animals brought from Iceland. They had to choose their settlement location with extreme care. It took the travelers another 3 hours to reach the ruins. As they progressed, Caroline shared information that archaeologists had discovered Viking settlements throughout the territory. They would visit the best preserved one. Caroline herself conducts archaeological research, seeking to learn more about their way of life and why they mysteriously disappeared. At this and other excavated sites, researchers gain a fairly complete understanding of how the Vikings lived. Their diet consisted of milk and dairy products, as well as lamb. They also hunted walruses, not only for food but also for trade. Walrus hides, skins, and tusks were highly prized. However, when ivory began to arrive in Europe, the demand for Viking walrus ivory declined, and they lost a significant source of income. Caroline insisted on visiting this place not only because it was beautifully preserved, but also because Eric the Red discovered it and declared he would never live anywhere else. The church at Brattahlid is one of the best preserved Viking structures. It was built when Christian missionaries arrived in Greenland from Scandinavia in the 12th century, 200 years after Eric and the first settlers arrived. Caroline reports that the last recorded event in this church was a wedding held in 1408, shortly before the mysterious disappearance of the colonists. The exact reason why the colony was abandoned is still unknown, but Caroline has her own theory about it. Scientists continue to actively debate the reasons for the disappearance of the Viking colony in Greenland. However, there is no doubt where the Vikings lived for 400 years. This place and this historical period are the central objects of their research. The next day, the researchers were to see how difficult navigation in Greenland's waters could be and learn how Leif, Erik's son, undertook the dangerous voyage across the Atlantic. Their current journey is an Atlantic adventure that traces the path of the most famous Viking explorer, Eric the Red. By now, they have learned how Eric left the European continent, traveled to Iceland, and was then exiled, becoming the first to explore and colonize Greenland, this vast icy island. They have traveled through the country, and the land that once welcomed the first settlers is as magnificent today as it was then. They also observed how the first Viking settlement in Greenland grew. Archaeologists suggest that the population reached over 2,000 inhabitants. Initially, the climate was warm enough for agriculture, but experts believe that steadily declining temperatures contributed to the colony's disappearance. Eric's farm is located on the other side of the fjord, and they still had to pass hundreds of icebergs. This is one of the most beautiful places a traveler has ever been, but it's important to remember that for the first settlers, it must have been extremely lonely. Even today, it is a difficult place to survive in winter. The Vikings hunted seals and walruses, not only for food but also for trade. Their hides, skins, and walrus tusks were highly prized, but when ivory began to arrive in Europe, the demand for Viking walrus ivory declined, and they lost a significant source of income. These icebergs seem beautiful, but they posed a huge danger to the 24 ships that sailed with Eric from Iceland to Greenland. One of the expedition members couldn't resist the temptation to get closer to an iceberg. He asked the captain if he could walk on one of these giant pieces of ice. The captain promised to try to find one large enough for the traveler to stand on, but warned that if he fell into the water, he would only have a few minutes to get back to the boat before freezing to death. Being too close to icebergs is dangerous because they can capsize or break off at any moment, throwing huge chunks of ice into the air. This iceberg was relatively small, but when they touched the ice, there it was, the moment. It was a short but very valuable experience. It took 13 days and 6 flights to get here, to this corner of history. Finally, the traveler could see where Erik lived on this huge, isolated island at the edge of the known world. In 1930, the ruins of Brattahlid were definitively identified as Erik's farm and have been actively studied ever since. The Longhouse was reconstructed. Erik's journey here coincided with the arrival of Christianity from the European continent. At the time the chapel was built, Viking culture began to undergo changes in all the lands they colonized. Many converted to Christianity. Leif was one of the first converts. He inherited his father's adventurous spirit, but not his wild and superstitious ways. According to Erik the Red saga, Leif is described as a large man, thoughtful and moderate in his judgments, and highly respected. He was an experienced sailor who transported goods to Iceland and Scandinavia from his father's colony in Greenland. He earned the nickname, the Lucky, after rescuing the crew of a sunken ship and salvaging its cargo. The expedition team traveled a long way to reach Erik's estate in Greenland. Having visited the ruins of Erik's home, they were convinced that Erik's epic journey ended here, in Greenland. At this pivotal moment in the magnificent narrative, the reins pass from father to son. From now on, the focus shifts to Leif's grand sea voyage. It remains to be seen whether Leif Erikson truly reached the shores of America. Researchers set out to cross the vast expanses of the Atlantic in search of tangible archaeological evidence capable of confirming that the captivating saga of the Norse Viking seafarers is not just a myth, but a historical reality. There is already undeniable evidence that the Vikings successfully colonized the harsh lands of Iceland and Greenland. However, the most striking and at times seemingly incredible saga tells how. In the year 1000, Leif Erikson dared a bold voyage across the North Atlantic and, according to tradition, discovered North America, preceding Christopher Columbus by a full 500 years. The saga details Leif's route. He discovered Baffin Island, which he named Helluland. His path then led south along the Labrador coastline, named Markland. Ultimately, the expedition landed on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, a place Leif called Vinland, because wild grapes were found there. Convincing evidence has already been found to support the authenticity of the sea voyages described in the ancient Icelandic sagas. However, it must be acknowledged that oral traditions, however fascinating, are less reliable and accurate than physical, material documents or archaeological finds. At the northernmost tip of Newfoundland lies a remarkable site known as L'Anse aux Meadows, a settlement consisting of sod houses built on a plot once considered an ancient camp. The curator of this historic site notes that this significant location was discovered in 1960. The structures found here are strikingly similar to the Norse colonies that researchers previously studied in Iceland and Greenland. It is here, on this plot of land, that the painstaking search for evidence confirming the authenticity of the ancient sagas continues. Archaeological investigations unequivocally demonstrate that Vikings indeed inhabited the northwestern American continent, within the territory that is now part of Canada. However, a legitimate question arises. Did their explorations extend further south, into the regions where the United States is now located? In addition to the astonishing archaeological discoveries already mentioned, another significant piece of evidence that Norse seafarers advanced considerably further south is the finding of an ancient butter churn. This artifact was discovered in the northern United States, as well as in southern Canada. Notably, characteristic traces of Viking butter churns have been found even at such northern latitudes. Such discoveries strongly suggest active trade interactions between Vikings and local populations during that historical period. This particular butter churn, therefore, serves as direct confirmation that Scandinavians explored the southern regions of Canada and, quite possibly, the northern territories of the United States. Furthermore, historians know that the Vikings' presence in these lands was very brief, lasting only 2 or 3 years. Although they undoubtedly possessed both advanced technology for their time and unparalleled courage to reach the shores of North America, about 1,000 years ago they concluded that these distant lands offered nothing they couldn't find much closer to their main settlements. For this reason, they decided to abandon these shores. Traces of their brief sojourn were erased by time and remained unnoticed for nearly a millennium. Notably, The sagas of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson were not recorded in official chronicles, and even representatives of the Catholic Church, who were actively pioneering new territories, made no attempts to search for them on the American continent. However, despite this historical oblivion, the presented evidence remains undeniable. A Viking vessel indeed explored the North American coastline 500 years before Christopher Columbus made his famous